Okay, I'm going to talk about international public relations, and for that I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of Hofstede's cultural principles or cultural dimensions. First of all, I suppose it's important to point out that there are pros and cons with this, and I think the major con is that it's quite what you would call essentialist. And an essentialist view is a view that everybody has an innate essence of which they are, and you can't escape that. It's just how you're born. So for example, the idea that women are innately caring and nurturing is an essentialist assumption. And it's interesting because in some areas of culture, they're completely acceptable and kind of like the gender thing considered actual truth. But you'll find that they're not actually stationary in culture, and they can change from culture to culture and throughout history. I think it's important to point out with essentialism that it's not true for everyone, and I think it's quite self-explanatory when you point it out that to say that everyone is innately something is really quite a fallacy. And even amongst an Australian culture, we are not all going to have the same views, attitudes as what our Australian stereotype would expect us to have. I think when using Hofstede's cultural principles, and therefore, with Hofstede's cultural principles, it is basically saying, such as Australia, I think rates like 90 on the individualism scale. So basically, its essentialist assumption is that from this score, all Australians innately have individualist values. So I think the examples were we value hard work and merit based on our hard work and individual hard work, and then when we enter jobs, we're expected to take initiative and learn on our own. To say that is true for every single Australian is of course a fallacy. It may be true in certain companies, like, I don't know, Myer or something may really value that, whereas a smaller, perhaps charity company such as Salvation Army may value a more collective approach. It's basically, although it's a good guide, it's really, you cannot say that it's going to be the same for everyone. So I think when using it for PR, as if you're on a large scale, it can be used as a good guideline. So, you know, because it gives you a kind of insight into what the general cultural practices might be. For example, the high power distance would probably, although it may not apply to every company, it's a general indication that you'll probably have to go through a secretary or another PR professional, and it might, they're then aware that it might be considered rude to go straight to the client if the client is high class or something like that. So I think for preliminary PR work and general attitude, it's a very good indication of the kind of attitude you should go in with. However, I also believe that personal experience is always the best indicator of a culture. However, I suppose if you don't have that, this can be considered a general guideline. However, it's important that you understand that it is only a guideline and that everyone you deal with may not adhere exactly to it. I think it's also telling that, because I remember in class I asked how they were rated, and I was told that the countries rate themselves. And I think this is really interesting because countries can't be subjective. Like, you can't be subjective outside your own context. No, can't be objective, sorry, they are subjective. And they can't be objective outside their own heads. And so I think it's actually, if you look at it like that, it's quite an interesting look on how a country will perceive themselves. And I think it's also important to realise that therefore the scores are going to manifest in different ways. So a Japanese person may consider a feminist country, perhaps Australia wouldn't consider a feminist. So while they may rate themselves highly on the scale, an Australian PR practitioner might not agree with their judgment of what is a feminine society. And so I think it's also important to realise that, you know, they might not translate very well from country to country. But other than that, I think it is a very good guideline as long as it's treated as such.